Winston Churchill was now back on the sidelines, waiting for his next opportunity to return to the seats of power. As no party obtained a majority, some time was required before a compromise was reached and Labour Party leader Ramsay MacDonald was called upon to form a government. MacDonald's government proved unable to move any initiatives without a solid majority in the House of Commons. Land taxers could feel good about only one appointment, that of Philip Snowden, to the cabinet as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Snowden was a committed supporter of the taxation of land values. Snowden declared, "There never was a time when the need was greater than it is today for the application of the philosophy and principles of Henry George to the economic and political conditions which are scourging the whole world. So long as land is a monopoly, and men are denied free access to it to apply their labor to its uses, poverty and unemployment will exist. I am of the opinion that economic rent belongs to society, and that no single person has the right to appropriate and enjoy what belongs to society." Although Winston and Philip Snowden held the same views regarding how to deal with the problem of land monopoly, Winston believed that Snowden's positions on other societal issues were dangerous. Winston elaborated on Snowden in a 1930 book titled Great Contemporaries. For nearly 40 years, Philip Snowden steadily and consistently built up the Socialist Party. He was no more a doctrinaire socialist than Ramsay MacDonald, but he revolted from socialism at a different angle. His heart was filled with an equal measure of disgust and pity when he contemplated the true blue conservative or the green-eyed socialist. The solitary new teacher whom Snowden and other radicals will admit very suspiciously to their mental parlors is Mr. Henry George. Snowden's rigidity of doctrine was otherwise impenetrable. Free imports, no matter what the foreigner may do to us. The gold standard, no matter how short we run of gold. Austere repayment of debt, no matter how we have to borrow the money. High progressive direct taxation, even if it brings creative energies to a standstill. The free breakfast table, even if it is entirely supplied from outside the British jurisdiction. For Winston, the decision by the Liberal Party leadership to support Ramsay MacDonald brought him to break for good with the Liberal Party. His next move was to try to regain a seat in the House of Commons. Announcing his candidacy and his change in party, he declared, "My candidature is in no way hostile to the Conservative Party or its leaders. On the contrary, I recognize that that party must now become the main rallying ground for the opponents of the Socialist Party. Indeed, anyone can see that a large measure of liberal support must be won by the Conservatives if there is to be an effective resistance in the big struggle that is coming and coming soon." Winston ran as an independent, a constitutionalist. His principles remained that of the classic liberal, but he now felt the party had abandoned those principles. Winston was once again rejected by the voters, yet he had sparked a growing reaction to the threat of socialism. The new government had little chance of survival and elections were called at the end of 1924. The Conservatives emerged victorious and Winston was among those elected. Stanley Baldwin brought Winston into the cabinet as his Chancellor of the Exchequer. Winston, fearful that Britain could suffer the fate of violent upheaval of class war, turned to the right. Lewis Broad describes his state of mind. Alarmed by the fear that the states of Europe might follow Russia into the abyss, he found cause to praise Mussolini and the Italian fascists, the necessary antidote to the Russian poison. Winston contributed to domestic unrest by his most significant economic policy decision, restoring Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war value of sterling. He had followed the advice of Treasury experts and London's finance capitalists with disastrous results. Britain's producers were already experiencing stiff competition, and a stronger currency made matters worse. The labor cost component of production could be forced down somewhat, displaced by investment in machinery. But land costs, absent Henry George's fiscal solution, could be reduced only by moving production facilities to where land costs were much lower. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist whose fame was rising, responded with a critical analysis: the economic consequence of Mr. Churchill. Winston, Keynes explained, had no instinctive judgment to prevent him from making mistakes. Lacking this instinctive judgment, he was deafened by the clamorous voices of conventional finance, and most of all, he was misled by his experts. The almost immediate consequence of returning to the pre-war price of gold was the threat of a nationwide strike by coal miners. This forced the government to subsidize the coal industry to prevent a fall in wages. The miners decided to strike anyway, and other trades unions joined them. Churchill assumed the role of propagandist for the government, which issued its own newspaper, the British Gazette. Members of the House of Commons, including David Lloyd George, attacked Winston for the gross distortions that filled the pages of the government newspaper. Nonetheless, the government outlasted the striking workers, although at the cost of lost external markets and other industrial dislocations. Domestic stability required that the government find new sources of revenue to soften the hardships of unemployment, while somehow controlling rising expenditures. Winston and Philip Snowden engaged frequently in debate over financial matters in the House of Commons. As Snowden later recalled, the debates between us became quite a parliamentary entertainment. They were regarded as the best show in London. When it was expected that we should both be speaking, the public galleries were invariably crowded. There was no further discussion of raising needed revenue by a higher tax on land values. Between 1925 and 1928, the highest rate of taxation on incomes was lowered, but this was countered by increased pension contributions. Other measures included a tax on wagers at racetracks, the reallocation of road funds for general purposes, taxes placed on wines, motor tires, and tobacco. Then in 1928, Churchill announced there would be a restructuring of the system of property rating for tax purposes. Lewis Broad explains. The object was to readjust rating burdens as between productive industries, which were unjustly burdened, and the distributing trades, which escaped their just dues. Relief was to be given by reducing the rates on all premises used for production and on freight-carrying railways, docks, and canals. Agricultural land would be freed of the last remaining 25% liability for rates. For Winston, just getting through this period of economic unrest without social upheaval seemed to be a victory. However, Britain's voters decided they had had enough and voted in the Labour Party. Many conservatives clamored for protectionism and imperial preference. To them, Winston's actions had only worsened the economic situation. There would be no place for Winston in the next conservative government. In April of 1929, Ramsay MacDonald promised leading land taxers that his government would begin to tax land values. Liberals pressed for the funding of new roads by means of a betterment tax on the increase in land values created by new public investment. However, within a few months came the stock market crash in the United States. In the face of worsening economic conditions, MacDonald sought to reach agreement on politics with both David Lloyd George and Stanley Baldwin. Despite a petition signed by 165 Labor and Liberal MPs, Snowden did not include the taxation of land values in the 1930 budget. Snowden merely called for land valuation. The measures became victim of the internal power struggle between parties. MacDonald was forced to form a national or coalition government, and a general election resulted in a conservative majority. Snowden was replaced by Neville Chamberlain, a staunch opponent of land reform. Neville Chamberlain pressed for suspension of the land valuation, ostensibly to save costs. Without the valuation, imposition of a land value tax would then be impossible. With what most politicians and the public saw as more global and pressing economic and foreign policy issues to face, any further consideration to the land question disappeared. As Roy Douglas wrote, for the remainder of the 1930s, the chief preoccupation of statesmen lay at first with industrial unemployment and later with international questions. Arguably, the land problem really stood at the root of both of these issues, but whether this be true or false, most men did not see things that way. Britain's voters decided at the end of the Second World War that their deeper interests would be best served by a government led by Labour. Out of 627 seats, Labour increased its number from 164 to 393, giving the party its first independent majority of 159 seats over all other parties. The Conservatives and their allies secured 213 seats, the Liberals 10, and other parties 11. Winston resigned as Prime Minister. Labour formed the new government headed by Clement Attlee. The party's official statement on the land question read as follows. Labour believes in land nationalization and will work towards it, but as a first step, the state and local authorities must have wider and speedier powers to acquire land for public purposes wherever the public interest so requires. In this regard, and for the purposes of controlling land use under town and country planning, we will provide for fair compensation, but we will also provide for public funds from betterment. Winston returned as Prime Minister in 1951, remaining silent on the land question until November of 1952, when he rose in the House of Commons to speak on a bill relating to town planning. I remember the old days, when the taxation of land values and of unearned increments in land was a foremost principle and a lively element in the program of the Radical Party to which I then belonged. But what is the situation which presents itself to us today? In those days, we had the spectacle of valuable land being kept out of the market until the exact moment for its sale was reached, regardless of the fact that its increased value was due to the exertions of the surrounding community. Then we had the idea that if those obstructions could be cleared out of the way, free enterprise would bound forward, and small people would have a chance to get a home or to improve their existing homes, and many other things besides. Sometime later, one of the handful of stalwart land taxers in Britain, reminded Churchill of his early campaigning to rid the nation of landed privilege. His response was that when the land taxers mustered the public support, the votes, he would again sing the land song. His general position on how government ought to raise needed revenue came down to this: for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to lift himself up by the handle. The opportunity for reform of the British system of land tenure has seemingly passed. History and the efforts of reformers had turned in a different direction. The Labour Party put its faith in planning, passing the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947. The act was supported by the Liberal Party, which alienated remaining liberals who continued to fight for the taxation of land values. A small group of liberals formed the Liberal Liberty League as a pressure group inside the party, but others orchestrated changes in the party rules so League members could no longer be affiliated with the party. After some time, the Liberal Party League merged with the Land Value Taxation League. Churchill had suffered a mild stroke in mid-1949. He experienced another more severe stroke in June of 1953 and finally left office in April 1955. After another stroke in mid-January 1965, he lingered on for 9 days, dying on the morning of the 24th of January. Labour returned to power in 1964, with a government formed under Harold Wilson as the new Prime Minister. The government created a land commission to acquire land the government planners sought for development. Private developers were then charged a betterment levy of 40% above the government's cost of acquisition. This measure lasted until the return of the Conservatives in 1971. In 1974, British voters returned a Labour government to power, which passed the Community Land Act of 1975, providing broad powers for compulsory land acquisition. This was followed by the Development Land Tax Act of 1976, which provided for the taxation of development values. None of these measures attacked the real problem of land monopoly and the private appropriation of the rental value of land. Britain's economy was heavily stressed by the rising cost of oil coming from OPEC-dominated Middle East producers. Remarkably, recession failed to dampen Britain's speculation-driven land markets. As Fred Harrison wrote in his 1983 book, The Power in the Land, following the 1973-74 collapse at the end of the previous cycle, land values recovered rapidly, reaching their 1973 speculative peaks within 5 years and during a period of ongoing recession. Few analysts other than Fred Harrison recognized that Britain's domestic land markets and not OPEC had triggered the national recession. Tracking the price of crude oil, Harrison noted, OPEC was quickly singled out as the fall guy, but this interpretation is implausible on timing. In fact, since the major price rise early in 1974, the cost of oil in relation to manufactured goods had declined. From 1976 onwards, UK consumers were paying less for crude oil in real terms. Winston Churchill may not have fully understood the connection between land rent monopoly and the inevitability of economic recessions, but at least some of his liberal colleagues did. Writing in 1909, C.H. Cholmondeley and R.L. Outhwaite put their case before the public. Proposals to tax land values are always and everywhere strenuously resisted by those in possession of them, who regard as sacred a form of property which enriches them without effort on their own part and lays the work of the world under tribute. The landowners have long been a privileged class, holding an undue proportion of wealth, influence, and power in the country, able thereby to remove most of the public burdens from their own to other shoulders, and they fiercely resent any attempt to make them pay for the privileges they enjoy by taxing the value of the land they hold. Still, the land question remains unanswered.